Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, where bedtime stories come draped in lace gloves buttoned to the chin and served with a lukewarm cup of tea that you must sip at precisely the right angle, lest society write you off as a complete barbarian. Tonight, we're not talking about swords, castles, or epic battles. Oh no, we're tiptoeing into the prim and proper parlour rooms of the Victorian era, a time when a misplaced "how do you do" could kill your social standing faster than cholera could kill your neighbours. And yes, cholera was still lurking outside the ballroom, but heaven forbid you talk about that at dinner. The Victorian period, roughly 1837 to 1901, was a time when Britain ruled a vast empire, but also when the empire ruled every tiny movement of its people's lives, not through soldiers, but through social rules so strict they made the Ten Commandments look like loose suggestions. There wasn't a single situation, from meeting a stranger in the park to sneezing at church, that didn't have a prescribed, civilized way to do it. And if you broke these rules, you didn't just risk raised eyebrows. You could lose invitations, family connections, and, in the worst case, your ability to marry into a decent income. Yes, social etiquette wasn't just about being polite. It was about survival. Imagine walking into a room where the air feels thick, not from the coal smoke drifting in from the street, but from the unspoken pressure to perform your role perfectly. You greet the hostess first, always, with a slight bow if you're a man, or a subtle curtsy if you're a woman. You never shake hands with someone of higher social standing unless they initiate it. And you absolutely do not plop yourself down in the nearest chair. Each seat was practically marked with invisible ownership, tied to status. Sit in the wrong place, and you might as well wear a sign around your neck reading, "I'm socially illiterate." It wasn't just about impressing people. Victorian etiquette served as a filter, a kind of social lock and key system. The upper class used it to keep out the wrong sort. Merchants who'd made new money, colonial returnees with strange habits, or anyone suspected of not knowing the right fork to use for fish. The irony? Half the aristocracy was secretly bankrupt, living in drafty old houses they couldn't afford to heat, but still pretending their place settings mattered more than their mortgages. Now, because we're going to travel through this world for 10 chapters, let's introduce two light recurring companions for the ride. Nothing too sentimental, just enough to carry a thread. Meet Mrs. Paxton, Temperance Grey, an observant widow with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye for breaches of etiquette, and Mr. C. Lionel Ashcombe, a perpetually nervous young gentleman whose sole ambition is to avoid embarrassing himself. Through their interactions, we'll peek into ballrooms, drawing rooms, and even the back alleys where the polite never dared to look. But make no mistake, our real focus will be on what etiquette meant, how it worked, and why it was both ridiculous and dangerously powerful. For example, let's talk about calling cards, the Victorian version of a friend request, except failure to follow the rules could socially delete you. A gentleman visiting a lady's home would present his card to the servant, folded a certain way depending on his reason for visiting. A folded corner might mean congratulations, another fold meant condolences, and no fold at all meant a formal call. And yes, people judged you based on your card's quality. If your paper was cheap or your engraving sloppy, you'd better have enjoyed your last polite cup of tea because you weren't getting another invitation. Of course, none of this stopped people from being absolute hypocrites. Behind closed doors, many respectable Victorians were involved in affairs, gambling, or shady investments, but in public you could get destroyed for minor infractions. Forgetting to remove your hat in a lady's presence? Scandalous. Talking about money at the dinner table? Outrageous. Showing your ankles in public? Social suicide. Unless you were rich enough that rules didn't apply to you, in which case people called it eccentricity instead of impropriety. And here's where the dark humour of Victorian etiquette comes in. While they fussed over how to butter bread without tearing it, Britain's industrial cities were choking on smog. Poor children were working 12-hour days in factories, and the streets were running with sewage. Yet to speak of such things in polite company was rude. In other words, the rules of good society weren't about kindness or morality. They were about keeping up appearances. Mrs. Ears Gray, our widow with an acid tongue, once summed it up to young Lionel in a way I'll never forget. My dear boy, in London, a man may drown kittens for sport and still be invited to supper, but heaven help him if he holds his teacup by the rim. It sounds absurd, but it's a perfect distillation of the era's values. Your image mattered more than your actions, and etiquette was the paint they used to hide the cracks in the wall. As we move deeper into this world, remember this. Victorian etiquette wasn't just a set of rules. It was a survival strategy, a performance, and a weapon. And like all performances, the audience was merciless. Every movement, every word, and every glance was a test. Fail, and you might not be physically exiled, but socially. You'd be as invisible as a chimney sweep in the Queen's ballroom. Next time, we'll step into the most perilous part of this social minefield, the greeting. Because if you think hello is safe territory, you've clearly never tried to survive a Victorian handshake. Chapter 2. Dining with Dignity or Disaster. If the Victorian drawing room was a minefield, the dining room was a battlefield dressed in linen and candlelight. It was here that reputations were made or destroyed, often before the soup course had even cooled. Eating in the Victorian era was not simply about satisfying hunger, it was about displaying breeding, wealth, and self-control. Every movement, from the way you unfolded your napkin to the pace of your chewing, was scrutinized. You could have been the most brilliant conversationalist in the city, but if you reached for the salt in the wrong way, you might never receive another invitation. And in a society where connections were currency, that was financial suicide in slow motion. The moment you entered a formal dinner, the rules began. You were seated according to rank, not personality, not charm, and certainly not who you got along with. The host or hostess, like a general placing troops, arranged the seating to flatter the most important guests, while keeping potentially troublesome personalities just far enough apart to avoid open warfare. Men and women alternated around the table, but not out of some modern notion of equality. Rather, it was to ensure constant, polite conversation between the sexes. It sounds pleasant until you realize you could be trapped between a deaf colonel who only spoke of fox hunting and a widow who would faint at the mention of trade unions. Napkins were a test in themselves. In our modern casual age, you might toss it across your lap without a second thought. But in Victorian society, the unfolding of a napkin was a performance. Too quick, and you appeared boorish. Too slow, and you risked looking uncertain. And uncertainty was unattractive. Once placed neatly on your lap, you could only dab your lips gently, never wipe, and certainly never use it to clean your hands. Those had to be kept immaculately still, only moving in slow, deliberate motions from plate to mouth. A dropped utensil was more than an inconvenience. It was a small tragedy, a visible crack in your polished facade. Even the way food was served reinforced the hierarchy. The upper classes embraced the French service style, dishes brought to the table for guests to help themselves, or the later Russian service, where servants placed portions directly on your plate. Either way, the display was as important as the flavour. Elaborate centerpieces of fruit, flowers, and sometimes even miniature sculptures were set up to impress, though often they were so large you could barely see the person opposite you. But the food itself? Let's just say that Victorian kitchens, despite their obsession with display, were not always havens of hygiene. Meats were often overcooked to disguise age. Sauces sometimes existed more to mask questionable flavours than to enhance them, and refrigeration was primitive at best. A guest might find themselves admiring a beautifully presented dish while quietly praying it wouldn't trigger an evening of digestive regret. The rules of eating were absurdly specific. Soup was to be sipped from the side of the spoon, never the tip, and always tilted away from you. Bread was to be torn into small pieces before being buttered, never bitten directly, as though you were some ravenous street urchin. Cheese was eaten with a knife and fork, not fingers. And fish? It had its own knife, shaped like a blunt, flat spatula, solely for the purpose of avoiding contact between your fork and the skin. Woe betide the guest who mixed cutlery. It was like wearing muddy boots to a wedding. And the conversation. The first rule: no talk of money, politics, or religion, which, frankly, eliminated anything interesting. What remained was a delicate dance of compliments, travel stories, and mutual flattery. It was all about maintaining the illusion that the world outside was orderly and genteel, even as poverty, disease, and industrial unrest were ripping through the cities. Mrs. Gray, with her usual talent for puncturing pretension, once told Lionel during a particularly stifling dinner, "Darling, it's not that we're avoiding unpleasant topics, it's that we've convinced ourselves they don't exist. Now smile, and ask the gentleman beside you about his roses, even though you both know they're dying from mildew. And let's not forget the servants, silent as shadows, moving in and out with military precision. Their invisibility was part of the etiquette. Guests were to pretend not to notice them, as if the food magically appeared without human hands." This was, of course, an open lie. The working class made the Victorian dining experience possible, yet the social code demanded they remain unseen and unheard. To speak to a servant without necessity was considered not kindness, but impropriety. In the world of Victorian etiquette, empathy was not on the menu. There was a particular cruelty in the system. The more elaborate the etiquette, the more it excluded those without the means or time to learn it. Self-made men, colonial merchants, and aspiring middle-class families might work for years to secure an invitation to an upper-class dinner, only to lose all hope of advancement because they buttered their bread incorrectly or held their wine glass by the bowl instead of the stem. These weren't just small mistakes. They were fatal blows to one's social ambitions. The dinner table was as much a battlefield for survival as the factory floor. Only here, the weapons were forks and words instead of steel and sweat. The hypocrisy was delicious in its own way. Behind the polished manners, many households were quietly struggling. The wine cellar might be stocked with bottles bought on credit. The roast might be the cheapest cut passed off as something finer, and the elaborate desserts might have been purchased from a local shop rather than prepared in-house. Yet the performance went on, because to admit otherwise was to lose face, and losing face meant losing position. In that sense, the dining room was less a place of nourishment and more a stage, and every guest an actor reading from the same unwritten script. And yet, for all its suffocating rules, the Victorian dinner was strangely compelling. There was a thrill in knowing that one wrong move could undo months of careful networking, a perverse satisfaction in watching someone else stumble while you held your ground. It was social Darwinism dressed in silk and candlelight, survival of the most polished. As Mrs. Gray whispered to Lionel once while passing the claret, "My dear, remember this, it's not the best who win, it's the best at pretending." Next, we'll slip away from the table and into the wardrobe, because in the Victorian world, what you wore could speak louder than anything you said, and the wrong fabric could be just as dangerous as the wrong words. If the first half of a Victorian dinner was a cautious dance of forks and glances, the second half was the real test, the conversational gauntlet, the subtle politics of seating, and the dangerous business of dessert. Once the main course plates were cleared, there was a shift in the atmosphere, though not necessarily toward relaxation. The pace of conversation increased, but so did the scrutiny. A person's true ability to navigate society was often revealed between the removal of the roast and the arrival of the pudding. You had to be alert, witty without being showy, agreeable without being dull, and above all, never so passionate on a subject that you risked offence. The Victorians liked their personalities the way they liked their puddings, sweet, neat, and served in moderation. Alcohol, while plentiful, was handled with its own set of unwritten laws. Men might enjoy multiple glasses of wine with the meal, but drunkenness was the mark of an amateur, the sort of thing that could reduce years of careful reputation building to ashes in a single evening. For women, drinking was more complicated. A lady might sip sherry or claret, but only in small, graceful quantities. Anything more suggested looseness of character. This double standard was, like much of Victorian etiquette, designed less to promote morality than to control image. Mrs. Theus, Gray once confided to Lionel over a discreetly poured glass of port that many respectable women consumed their real drink before arriving at dinner. A quick brandy in the privacy of a dressing room, to avoid the appearance of indulgence in public. "Darling," she said with a smirk, "one mustn't drink at the table, but one must also survive the company." Then came the issue of toasts. A toast was both an honor and a potential trap. Rising to speak meant all eyes upon you, and your success hinged on brevity, wit, and not accidentally revealing something that should remain private. Too short, and you risked being thought insincere. Too long, and you could bore your audience into hostility. The truly skilled could weave a compliment that flattered the host, nodded to the guests, and revealed nothing about themselves. The less skilled stumbled, mumbled, and became the evening's cautionary tale. And yes, people remembered. Victorian society thrived on memory, and your performance at a single dinner could be discussed months later in rooms you'd never enter again. Dessert itself was an exercise in controlled enjoyment. Fruits, pastries, and creams were presented with elegance, but even here rules applied. You did not bite into a piece of fruit like a farmhand. You cut it with a knife and ate it with a fork. Grapes were to be peeled, seeds discreetly removed and never spat out. Ice creams and custards were to be eaten slowly, no clinking of spoons against the dish. To modern ears this might sound exhausting, and it was. The goal was not pleasure. The goal was demonstration of restraint, of refinement, of your ability to master even the act of eating. And then came the great divide, the withdrawal of the ladies. At a certain point after dessert, the women would rise from the table and retire to the drawing room for tea, leaving the men behind to drink brandy, smoke cigars, and discuss matters unsuitable for female ears. This ritual was less about protecting delicate sensibilities and more about maintaining the gender hierarchy that underpinned the whole of Victorian life. It was a reminder that, no matter how elegantly a woman navigated the dinner table, her role was ultimately separate and subordinate. Mrs. Subordinate Gray, who tolerated the tradition only because it gave her a moment away from certain boorish men, once remarked that the only unsuitable topic for female ears was the truth. For the men, this after-dinner period was where business could be quietly discussed, deals floated, and alliances formed. Politics might surface here, alongside gossip that was too sharp to share in mixed company. The irony, of course, was that the women in the drawing room were often far better informed than their male counterparts, having spent the meal gathering information through subtle conversation. But etiquette dictated that they remain on the sidelines, smiling over tea, while the real decisions were made in smoke-filled rooms. The servants, meanwhile, continued their silent ballet. Dishes were cleared, crumbs swept from the tablecloth with small silver brushes, glasses refilled without request. Their efficiency was a performance in itself, honed by endless repetition and the constant threat of dismissal for even small mistakes. And yet, these were the people who knew the most about the households they served. They saw the nervous glances, the whispered asides, the half-empty plates returned to the kitchen. They heard what the guests said when they thought no one was listening. In many ways, they were the unseen chroniclers of Victorian society, though their knowledge was a dangerous kind. To repeat it could cost them everything. By the end of the evening, the dinner had done its work. Alliances had been strengthened, rivals subtly undermined, and the social hierarchy reaffirmed. Everyone left knowing exactly who was in favour, who was falling, and who had committed a small but unforgettable blunder. It was never just a meal. It was a social audit, performed under the cover of fine dining. Lionel, still finding his footing in this world, once told Mrs. Gray he thought a dinner invitation was simply a kind gesture. She laughed so hard she nearly spilled her tea. "My dear boy, a dinner is never just a dinner. It's an examination, and the grade you receive determines whether you're invited back or erased." And that was the truth of Victorian dining etiquette. It wasn't about the food, the drink, or even the conversation. It was about survival in a world where your social position was as fragile as the crystal glassware on the table. The rules were complex, the stakes were high, and the game never truly ended. Even as the last carriage rattled away from the curb, the evening's events were being dissected in private, judgments formed, reputations adjusted. In the Victorian world, dignity was always on the line, and disaster was just a misplaced fork away. Next, we move from the dinner table to the wardrobe, where fabric, colour and cut could determine your entire social trajectory. In the Victorian era, your clothes didn't just make the man, they made the future of your name. Chapter 3. Fashion as a moral compass. In the Victorian era, you didn't just wear clothes, you wore your soul on your sleeve, and society inspected the stitching. Fashion wasn't merely about beauty or personal taste. It was a moral declaration, a social status report, and in many cases, a survival tool. The fabrics you chose, the colors you wore, even the shape of your silhouette told the world who you were, what you believed, and most importantly, whether you were worth talking to. If dinner parties were an exam in etiquette, your clothing was the entrance ticket, and no one got in without passing inspection. From the moment Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, her personal style began to shape the nation. She preferred modesty, favouring high necklines, long sleeves, and full skirts, a style that reinforced the idea that women's virtue was tied to their physical concealment. Society followed her lead, not out of shared morality, but because the Queen's preferences became the gold standard for respectable appearance. To dress otherwise was to risk whispers about your character, and Victorian whispers had sharp teeth. For women, the stakes were punishingly high. Every outfit had to be correct for the time of day, the occasion, and the season. Morning dresses were light and simple, suitable for receiving visitors at home, while afternoon dresses were heavier, with richer fabrics to signal the importance of social calls. Evening gowns were the real test. Low necklines and short sleeves were acceptable only after sunset, and even then, only in the proper company. A lady who revealed too much skin at the wrong time was branded as fast, a polite euphemism for morally suspect. The sheer volume of clothing was staggering. A fashionable woman might change outfits 4 or 5 times in a single day, each ensemble requiring its own accessories. Gloves, hats, parasols, shawls, and sometimes even fans, coded to convey subtle messages. Dressing wasn't just a matter of pulling clothes on, it was a production requiring the assistance of at least one maid, sometimes 2, and while the middle and lower classes could not afford such extravagance, they were expected to imitate it as closely as possible. This often meant stretching budgets to breaking point, or wearing hand-me-downs, so carefully altered that they barely held together. But appearance was worth the cost. In a world obsessed with surface, a frayed cuff could be as socially damaging as a public insult. Men had their own rules, though they were less punishing in variety and more focused on precision. A gentleman's day suit had to be perfectly tailored, with a clean shirt front and a cravat tied just so. Hats were non-negotiable, a top hat for formal occasions, a bowler or Homburg for more casual ones. Shoes were always polished to a mirror finish, because dusty boots suggested you'd been walking, and walking suggested poverty. Even facial hair was subject to fashion's moral code. Sideburns, moustaches, and beards came in and out of vogue, each style carrying its own associations with politics, class, and masculinity. What's remarkable is how Victorian fashion doubled as a form of control. Clothing dictated movement. Corsets, crinolines, and bustles made it nearly impossible for women to run, bend freely, or even sit comfortably. It wasn't a flaw in design, it was the point. A physically restricted woman was a publicly virtuous one, at least in the eyes of Victorian society. Her limitations were a badge of respectability. Men, on the other hand, enjoyed far greater freedom of movement, though their clothes still reinforced their role as the active, public-facing half of the species. Of course, the dark underbelly of this obsession with dress was the labour that made it possible. Behind every immaculate gown and crisply tailored coat was a chain of workers, seamstresses, tailors, dyers, many of whom laboured in dangerous, unventilated workshops for starvation wages. The dyes that produced the brilliant purples, greens and blues of fashionable clothing were often made with arsenic, mercury and other toxins. Workers absorbed these poisons through their skin and lungs, sometimes dying for the sake of a season's trend. And the wealthy who wore these colours? They might suffer too, though in their case it was more likely to be a rash or hair loss than outright death. Still, you'd think wearing a dress that could poison you might have dampened enthusiasm. It didn't. Mrs. Gray, as usual, saw through the hypocrisy. The more fabric they pile on a woman, Lionel, the less they expect her to think, she remarked one summer afternoon, as they watched a parade of overdressed ladies stroll through Hyde Park. And the more feathers on her hat, the more likely some poor creature died for it. She wasn't exaggerating. The craze for feathered hats drove certain bird species to near extinction, their plumes ripped from bodies and sold as luxury adornments. Yet this cruelty was invisible to polite society, because the rules of fashion demanded beauty, not conscience. Even mourning had its dress code. When a relative died, women were expected to wear black, dull, heavy, and without ornament, for a set period, depending on their relationship to the deceased. A widow, for instance, was supposed to remain in full mourning for 2 years, gradually shifting to half mourning with muted greys and purples. Men, naturally, had it easier. A black armband or a dark suit sufficed. Here, as in so much of Victorian life, etiquette was less about shared grief and more about public performance. It didn't matter if you truly mourned the dead, only that you looked like you did, and all of this came at a cost, not just financial, but personal. To live in constant awareness of your clothing was to live in constant awareness of judgment. A single slip could undo years of careful cultivation, and the fear of such slips kept people in line. Fashion was a leash disguised as a luxury, a way to bind people to the unspoken rules of their class. Those who tried to break free, dressing too simply or unconventionally, often found themselves quietly excluded from the social circles that mattered. In the end, Victorian fashion wasn't about self-expression at all. It was about conformity. It was about telling the world you knew the rules and had the means to follow them. And, as with every other aspect of etiquette, it was about keeping people in their place. Next, we'll step into the strange and stifling world of Victorian courtship, where a fluttering fan or the choice of a flower could speak louder than a shouted declaration of love, and where breaking the rules could ruin more than your reputation. If the first impression you made in Victorian society came from your manners, the second was from your clothing, and it could be even more unforgiving. You could speak flawlessly, navigate every greeting with precision, and still find yourself dismissed if your wardrobe betrayed you. Fashion was the unspoken biography you wore every day, and it told a far more detailed story than you might like. Every stitch, every fabric, every hue was a signal. The wealthy knew the code intimately, and they wielded it like a weapon, often without even realizing it. And those trying to climb into the upper echelons learned quickly that mastering the language of clothes was not optional, it was survival. The Victorian obsession with dressing for the occasion reached levels that would make even modern celebrities, with their endless red carpet changes, look restrained. A visit to a friend's home in the morning required a morning dress. Modest, plain, light in colour. An afternoon promenade demanded richer tones, heavier fabrics, and an elaborate bonnet. An evening out meant full formal wear, gowns dripping with embellishments, gloves that stretched past the elbow, and jewellery chosen not for personal taste, but for what it conveyed about your social standing. For men, it was tailcoats, crisp waistcoats, and trousers so perfectly creased you could slice a cucumber with them. Step out in the wrong outfit at the wrong time, and you might as well wear a placard reading, "I don't belong here." And then there was the tyranny of trends. Styles changed with dizzying speed, at least for the wealthy who could afford to follow them. Skirt shapes expanded and contracted like an accordion across the decades. From the enormous bell-like crinolines of the 1850s to the narrow, restrictive hobble skirts of the 1890s, bustle swelled and deflated according to fashion's whims, often forcing women to walk with the awkwardness of someone trying not to drop a priceless vase. Shoes, rarely seen beneath all that fabric, still had to be elegant and spotless. This was a society where appearances mattered even when they weren't visible. Of course, maintaining such wardrobes came with costs, literal and metaphorical. The literal cost was ruinous for many families trying to maintain the illusion of gentility. Clothing was expensive, and fashion demanded constant renewal. Middle-class women often learned to alter dresses themselves, turning last year's gown into something resembling the current style, or paying a seamstress to do it for less than a fashionable dressmaker would charge. The metaphorical cost was in time, energy, and physical comfort. Dressing each morning could take hours, especially for women. Corsets, layered petticoats, and skirts weighing several pounds were not thrown on lightly. And once you were dressed, you lived within the limitations your outfit imposed. Running, bending, or even breathing deeply was discouraged by both the garment and society. The dark irony was that the same society that idolized the delicate, graceful woman also made her physically incapable of self-sufficiency. This wasn't an accident. A woman confined by fashion was a woman dependent on others, especially men. Especially men. Gray, never one to mince words, put it plainly one evening as she helped her niece out of a particularly elaborate gown. "These clothes aren't meant to make you beautiful, my dear. They're meant to make you helpless, and that's the beauty men prefer." Lionel, who overheard, pretended to busy himself with his cravat, but looked as though someone had just told him the earth was round after all. And the dangers of fashion weren't limited to social consequences. The industry's thirst for novelty led to some truly lethal trends. Arsenic-based dyes produced a vibrant green that became wildly popular in the mid-19th century, despite the fact that it could blister the skin and cause severe illness. Flammable fabrics like tulle and muslin were worn near open flames, leading to horrifying accidents when skirts caught fire from candles or hearths. Feathered hats, as we've mentioned, decimated bird populations, and the elaborate taxidermy of small birds for decoration was grotesquely common. Yet no matter how many workers sickened or how many women burned alive, the trends rolled on, because elegance was more important than safety. Even the undergarments had their own strict etiquette. A respectable woman's drawers were expected to be made of fine cotton or linen, trimmed with lace, and scrupulously clean, despite the fact that laundry was an exhausting chore for servants or working-class women who handled it themselves. Stockings were to be silk if you could afford them, wool if you couldn't, but never mismatched. And everything had to be kept in readiness for those inevitable moments when an unexpected invitation required you to change on short notice. Victorian life was a perpetual state of sartorial readiness, as though the Queen herself might drop by at any moment. For men, the rules were less numerous but equally rigid. The fit of your coat, the knot of your cravat, and the shine of your shoes could make or break you in the eyes of your peers. Gentlemen's fashion avoided flamboyance, except when it didn't. Waistcoats in bright colours and patterns were acceptable flourishes, but only within certain limits. Go too far, and you were a peacock. Too restrained, and you risked looking like a clerk, which in some circles was social death. Beards, once considered a sign of rugged masculinity, fell in and out of favour, and you had to keep pace or risk looking dated. At its core, Victorian fashion was a game of controlled display. You had to appear prosperous without appearing vain, modest without seeming dowdy, fashionable without seeming frivolous. It was a balancing act that rewarded those with both means and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Everyone else was simply playing dress-up and hoping no one noticed the seams. And society noticed everything. By the end of the century, some reformers began to push back against the extremes, promoting simpler dresses, looser corsets, and more practical clothing. But they were dismissed by many as radicals, even dangerous. Simplicity threatened the entire system, Because if clothing ceased to be a marker of class and morality, what would happen to the carefully constructed social pyramid? In truth, Victorian fashion was never just about fabric. It was about control, about telling the world exactly where you belonged, and making sure everyone else knew it too. Next, we'll step into the dance of Victorian courtship, a realm so tightly bound by etiquette that even love letters had to obey the rules. In this world, a glance could be scandal, a touch could be a proposal, and a single misstep could turn romance into ruin. Chapter 4. Courtship and the Code of Love. If you think modern dating is exhausting, imagine navigating romance in the Victorian era, where a single misplaced glance could damage your reputation beyond repair. Courtship in those days wasn't just about love. In fact, love was often the least important part of the equation. It was about alliances, status, and mutual benefit. Marriage was a transaction disguised as poetry, a business arrangement swaddled in flowers and candlelight, and etiquette was the iron frame that held it all together. You couldn't just meet someone. You had to be introduced, vetted, and presented as though you were a fine china tea set. For women, the stakes were impossibly high. A respectable lady could not approach a man in public, could not speak to him without a formal introduction, and could not be seen alone with him without risking whispers. Even the appearance of impropriety could derail a young woman's future. And since most women's futures depended heavily on marriage, the risk was enormous. Men had more freedom, of course, but their reputations could also be dented by careless associations. In the upper classes, it was expected that you would marry within your social rank, preferably improving your financial position in the process. Love, if it came at all, was expected to grow later, quietly and without disturbing the family balance. There was, however, an elaborate silent language of courtship. Fans, gloves, flowers, and even the position of one's parasol could convey meaning. A woman might use a fluttering fan to signal interest or disinterest. A certain way of holding it could mean, "Follow me," or "Leave me alone." Gloves could be drawn on slowly to suggest hesitation, or removed with graceful deliberation to indicate openness. Flowers, too, were coded. A red rose for passionate love, a yellow rose for jealousy, a sprig of lavender for devotion. Entire conversations could take place without a word being spoken, though of course the real meaning was often clear only to the intended recipient. To everyone else, it looked like two people awkwardly adjusting accessories. Letters played a crucial role, but even here, etiquette reigned supreme. A lady could not write to a gentleman without permission from her family, and any correspondence was expected to be chaperoned in spirit, if not in fact. The handwriting, the quality of the paper, the choice of ink, all were subject to scrutiny. A hastily scrawled note might be interpreted as carelessness or emotional instability. In extreme cases, even the folds of the paper carried meaning, with some lovers devising their own secret systems for slipping in extra sentiment between polite lines. But woe to the woman whose letter fell into the wrong hands. Private feelings could be weaponized in a heartbeat. Mrs. Thone Gray, who had been widowed young and had endured the strange rituals of courtship twice over, had her own theory. It's not love they're after, Lionel. It's a good fit between property and personality, and the property part always outweighs the rest. She wasn't entirely cynical, but she was honest about the realities. In her own youth, she had received suitors who cared less about her smile than about the number of acres attached to her late father's estate. Lionel, ever the romantic, looked stricken. "But surely," he protested, "some people married for love." Mrs. Gray allowed herself a thin smile. "Yes, dear boy, but those marriages were whispered about as though the couple had eloped to the circus. Public outings were a delicate matter. A walk in the park was acceptable, but only with a chaperone. The theatre could be appropriate if you sat in the right section and avoided scandalous plays. Dancing at a ball was one of the few moments when physical contact was permitted, but even then the embrace was formal, the steps practiced, and the duration limited. A man could not monopolize a lady's dances without raising eyebrows, and a lady could not refuse too many offers without inviting speculation about her health or her character. It was a constant balancing act. Be available but not eager, charming but not forward, interested but not desperate, and heaven help you if gossip attached itself to your name. The Victorian rumour mill was relentless, and reputations could be destroyed by innuendo alone. A woman seen laughing too freely with a man might be labelled fast, while a man who lingered too long in a lady's company without making an offer could be accused of trifling with her affections. The irony was that some of the most scandalous affairs of the age unfolded behind the most impeccable facades, proving once again that Victorian etiquette was more about appearances than morality. The economic side of courtship was rarely spoken of directly, but it loomed over every interaction. Dowries, inheritances, and family connections mattered as much as personal compatibility, often more. Parents and guardians orchestrated matches like generals planning campaigns, weighing the advantages and disadvantages of each potential union. And while romantic novels painted marriage as the culmination of passion, the reality was that many couples began their married lives as polite strangers. Some grew into friendship and affection. Others simply learned to coexist. The darker truth was that women had far more to lose in this system. A man could afford a failed romance, or even a scandal, and still recover his position. A woman, particularly from the middle or upper classes, had no such luxury. Her marriage prospects could vanish over a single mistake, leaving her to face a life of diminished status and dependence on relatives. This was not merely social inconvenience, it was economic exile. And yet, within this rigid structure, people found ways to rebel. Lovers met in secret, passed coded messages, and used the very tools of etiquette to disguise their intentions. A fan could hide more than a blush, it could conceal a note. A bouquet might carry a scent meant only for one person to recognize. There was an art to bending the rules without breaking them, and those who mastered it could navigate the tightrope of Victorian courtship with remarkable skill. By the end of the century, change was creeping in. The rise of the middle class, shifting gender roles, and new social spaces like public gardens and department stores created opportunities for more casual interactions. But the old rules still lingered, and many clung to them as if to let go would be to let the whole social order collapse. In truth, courtship in the Victorian era was less about finding a soulmate and more about proving you were worthy of the marriage market. A place where love might appear as a happy accident, but was never the primary goal. Next, we'll move deeper into the home, exploring how etiquette governed the relationships between masters, mistresses, and servants, and how the lines of respectability were drawn as much by silence as by speech. If the first act of Victorian courtship was the performance in public, the carefully orchestrated glances, the dances monitored by watchful chaperones, the perfectly folded letters, then the second act unfolded in private parlours and drawing rooms. Here, the rules shifted, though never so much that you could truly breathe. A man might call upon a lady at her home, but only at the prescribed visiting hours, which were absurdly specific, often a 2-hour window in the late afternoon when the lady of the house would be at home to receive guests. Arrive too early and you were overeager. Arrive too late and you risked interrupting another suitor, which was a social embarrassment of the highest order. Once inside, the choreography continued. If you were a gentleman, you presented your calling card to the servant at the door, who would discreetly carry it to the lady. If she accepted, you were shown in. If not, the servant returned with the crushing news that Miss is not receiving today, which everyone knew was code for Miss is receiving someone else, or Miss has no interest in receiving you at all. The servant was a silent gatekeeper of romance, holding the power to grant or deny access with a single polite phrase. Conversation in these visits was a test in itself. The goal was to appear charming and attentive, without crossing the invisible lines that separated respect from presumption. You could compliment a lady's piano playing, but not her appearance. You could remark on the weather, but never on her health, unless she brought it up first. Personal questions were a minefield, and humour was risky unless it was of the most harmless variety. If the conversation flagged, the lady might take up some needlework while the gentleman scrambled to find a safe topic, perhaps commenting on the latest botanical discovery or the Queen's most recent public appearance. And then there was the chaperone, the silent reminder that you were never truly alone. Often it was a mother, aunt, or older sister, sitting nearby with embroidery or a book, pretending not to listen but catching every word. Her presence was meant to safeguard the lady's reputation, though it also served to keep conversations firmly within the boundaries of propriety. The idea of allowing two unmarried people to speak privately for more than a few minutes was considered reckless, as though unmonitored conversation might spontaneously lead to scandal. The darker side of all this surveillance was that it left very little room for genuine emotional connection. Relationships progressed under constant observation, and people became adept at wearing the same polite mask for hours at a time. True feelings had to be tucked into coded phrases or shared in fleeting moments when a chaperone's attention wavered, and even then, caution was necessary. If you were caught whispering or exchanging significant looks, it could set the gossip mill churning. In a world where rumors could ruin a woman's future, discretion wasn't just advised, it was essential. The engagement process was its own labyrinth of etiquette. A man wishing to propose had to first seek the blessing of the woman's father or guardian. This was less about romance and more about negotiation. Discussions of dowries, inheritances, and property often took place before the lady was even informed of the offer. Once the proposal was accepted, it was announced formally, sometimes in the newspapers, and both parties were expected to behave with even greater decorum than before. Physical affection remained minimal. Engagements were not a license for intimacy. The couple continued to be chaperoned, and any sign of impatience for the wedding day was frowned upon. Breaking an engagement was scandalous, though not equally so for both parties. A man might suffer some loss of reputation, but a woman's prospects could be permanently damaged, especially if there were whispers, true or not, that she had been compromised during the courtship. Some engagements limped along out of duty rather than affection, with both parties trapped by the weight of public expectation. In these cases, the wedding day was less a joyful beginning than a formal conclusion to a long, exhausting performance. And yet, beneath all these constraints, love still found its way. Couples exchanged glances over tea trays, met unexpectedly at public events, or used mutual friends to relay messages. Some became skilled in the art of coded correspondence, slipping personal sentiments into otherwise innocuous notes. Others used the rigid structure of dances and dinner parties to their advantage, stealing brief moments when no one was looking. These small rebellions were rarely dramatic, but they were deeply significant to those living within the confines of the Victorian marriage market. Mrs. B. Gray, who had long since lost patience for the pretense, once confided to Lionel that she thought the whole system was designed less to promote virtue than to delay reality. Marriage, she said dryly, is the only contract in which both parties are expected to pretend they've never spoken privately before signing. It's no wonder so many are shocked to discover they've married a stranger. Lionel, who had begun to suspect she was right, asked her if she thought love could survive such an arrangement. She shrugged. Sometimes, but more often, it learns to adapt, like a plant that survives in the dark, pale, and a little twisted, but alive. By the close of the century, cracks were beginning to show in the old ways. Social reform movements, the growing independence of middle-class women, and new forms of leisure were creating opportunities for less formal interactions. Still, the rules of courtship retained their grip, especially among the upper classes. Even as the world outside began to change, the parlour remained a fortress of tradition, where every word and gesture was weighed and measured before it was allowed to escape into the air. Next, we will step into the sharply divided household itself, where etiquette dictated not only how masters and mistresses treated their servants, but how servants were expected to navigate the invisible but unbreakable lines of the Victorian class divide. Chapter 5. Servants, Masters, and the Social Divide. If Victorian courtship was a delicate dance, then life inside the home was a rigid military parade, with every person knowing exactly where they belonged and where they didn't. Etiquette didn't stop at the front door. It followed you inside, dictating not just how masters and mistresses interacted with their guests, but how they treated the army of servants who kept the whole charade running. In truth, the Victorian household was less a cosy family home and more a miniature version of the class system itself, complete with invisible walls, unspoken rules, and consequences for those who crossed the wrong line. The hierarchy was clear. At the top stood the master and mistress, their authority absolute within the walls of their home. Below them came the upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the valet. These positions carried a certain prestige within the servant class, and their holders were expected to enforce the rules as much as the employers themselves. Below them were the lower servants, the kitchen maids, footmen, scullery maids, laundry maids, and hall boys, whose work was harder, hours longer, and pay far less. And at the very bottom were the day labourers, often unseen by the family, who came in only when needed. The division between upstairs and downstairs wasn't just architectural, it was social law. Servants were expected to be nearly invisible in the presence of their employers. They moved quietly, spoke only when spoken to, and avoided eye contact unless it was necessary. The ideal servant was like a well-oiled machine, efficient, silent, and unquestioningly obedient. And for the master or mistress, politeness towards servants was optional, though some prided themselves on their kindness, which often meant little more than remembering a birthday or allowing an extra half-day off at Christmas. Meals were the clearest example of this separation. The family dined upstairs, served in courses on fine china, while the servants ate in the servants' hall at entirely different times. There was no mingling. In most homes, it would have been unthinkable for a servant to share a table with the family, no matter how long they had been in service. Even the way servants addressed their employers reinforced the gap. Sir, madam, my lady, while the employers often referred to their staff only by surname, stripping away any sense of personal equality. But the divide went deeper than titles and seating arrangements. Servants were expected to know everything about their employers, their schedules, preferences, moods, yet the reverse was considered unnecessary, even improper. Many mistresses prided themselves on knowing little about the personal lives of their staff, as though ignorance preserved some imaginary purity of the class barrier. Mrs. Thiers Gray once remarked to Lionel, "A lady may know the names of her butler's children, but she will never know their birthdays. And if she does, she'll never admit it. It would make her far too human." The hypocrisy was staggering. Employers depended on their servants for their comfort, their status, even their reputations, and yet treated them as if they existed in a separate moral universe. Servants knew every family secret, overheard arguments, clandestine romances, financial troubles, but were expected to keep silent under the unspoken threat of dismissal. This silence wasn't just professional courtesy, it was survival. A servant who gossiped could be blacklisted, unable to find work in another respectable household. The working conditions were grueling. Many servants rose before dawn to light fires, polish silver, and prepare breakfast, and did not finish until late at night after the last candle was snuffed out. Time off was minimal, often just a few hours on Sunday, and even that could be interrupted if the family required something. Privacy was almost non-existent. Lower servants often shared cramped attic rooms, while the upper servants might have slightly better quarters, but were still very much on call. Pay was low, but living in was considered part of the compensation, as though the privilege of sleeping in an unheated attic somehow balanced the scales. For women in service, the dangers extended beyond exhaustion. There was always the risk of unwanted attention from male employers or higher-ranking servants. A lady's maid could find herself the subject of gossip, or worse, if she became the target of the master's interest. And while Victorian society prided itself on morality, It was far more likely to punish the servant than the master in such cases. A ruined reputation could mean the end of a woman's livelihood, forcing her into far less respectable and more dangerous forms of work. For all the cruelty of the system, many households clung to the belief that a well-run home depended on these strict divisions. Employers claimed it was natural for the classes to remain separate, that blurring the lines would lead to chaos. This was nonsense, of course. What they feared wasn't chaos, but equality. The etiquette of the household was designed to remind everyone, every day, who held the power. The very architecture of Victorian homes reflected this. Separate staircases for servants, narrow hallways hidden from guests, and doors that opened directly into work areas to keep staff out of sight. Yet servants were not without influence. A skilled butler or housekeeper could make or break a household's social standing. The smooth running of dinner parties, the immaculate state of the silver, the precision of the place settings, all of these reflected on the family's reputation. In this way, servants became the invisible hands that upheld the illusion of refinement, and they knew it. Quietly, subtly, they could bend the rules in small ways, delaying a message, rearranging a guest list, or ensuring certain bits of gossip reached certain ears. It was a kind of soft power, and those who mastered it could wield surprising influence behind the scenes. By the end of the century, some changes were beginning to stir. The rise of industry and the growing opportunities for employment outside domestic service meant that households had to work harder to keep staff. Wages improved slightly, hours became marginally less brutal, and the most progressive families even began to treat their servants with something approaching respect. But for most, the old etiquette lingered. The belief that hierarchy was not just tradition, but a moral necessity. And in that belief, the Victorian household remained a miniature kingdom, its rulers convinced that the order they maintained inside mirrored the natural order of the world outside. Next, we'll descend further into this hidden world, exploring the servants' hall, a place where rules still ruled, but where class barriers bent just enough for gossip, alliances, and quiet rebellion to thrive. Hall was the backstage, cramped, overheated, and full of the real drama that kept the performance running. This was where the people who ironed the linen, polished the silver, and endured the whims of their employers finally sat down, not to rest exactly, but to exist for a moment without being invisible. Here, the rigid etiquette of upstairs softened slightly, though not enough to erase the hierarchy that ruled even among the staff. There was always an order of precedence. The butler sat at the head of the table, the housekeeper opposite him, senior servants next, and the juniors at the far end. It mirrored the structure upstairs almost perfectly, proof that the class system seeped into every corner of Victorian life, no matter how far from the chandeliers you went. Meals in the servants' hall were simpler, of course. Boiled meats, stews, bread, and endless tea. But they were still subject to rules. Juniors waited to eat until the seniors had been served. Conversation was to be kept polite, and any disputes were handled quietly, at least in theory. In reality, the hall was a place where tempers flared, gossip flowed like water, and alliances were formed in whispers over mugs of weak tea. It was also where the truth about the family upstairs was discussed with a frankness that would have sent the mistress into a dead faint. Servants saw and heard everything, from the master's late-night returns smelling of perfume that wasn't his wife's, to the hidden bills for dresses that had been in the family for years. For those in service, gossip was both entertainment and currency. Information could be traded, carefully leaked, or held back as a form of leverage. A maid who knew too much could make herself inconvenient to dismiss, and a butler with a particularly juicy secret might wield more quiet power than the master realized. Of course, such leverage was dangerous. Push too far, and you could find yourself unemployed, your reference mysteriously misplaced, effectively shutting you out of respectable service for good. Life in the servants' quarters was hard, and often thankless. The hours were punishing. Breakfast for the family had to be ready before they rose, fires lit before the house stirred, and the day's cleaning began before most people had even opened their eyes. The work was physically demanding, hauling coal, scrubbing floors, polishing endless silverware until it gleamed like mirrors. And while the family upstairs might retire at 10, the servants often worked well into the night, tidying up after dinner parties, preparing rooms for the next day, and making sure every visible surface sparkled. Rest came in snatches, never in luxury. Privacy was almost non-existent. Lower servants shared small attic rooms, often with little heat in winter and stifling heat in summer. Personal possessions had to be kept to a minimum, and even letters from home might be read aloud or shared, willingly or not. Relationships between servants were tolerated only if they didn't interfere with work, though in practice, romance did happen. Sometimes quietly, sometimes with the kind of scandal that got people dismissed. For women especially, any hint of impropriety could ruin a career, even if the impropriety was imagined. And while a gentleman upstairs might emerge from scandal with a shrug, a maid downstairs could find herself on the street with nowhere to go. The upper servants, the butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, and valet, lived in a curious limbo. They were trusted with the family's most intimate needs, yet they were never truly part of the family. A lady's maid might dress her mistress every morning, help her undress at night, and know every freckle and scar on her body, but she was still expected to address her formally and never overstep the invisible boundary between service and friendship. The butler might manage the wine cellar and supervise the entire household staff, but he would never be invited to dine at the family table. They existed in the delicate space between respect and servitude, valued but never equal. The unspoken rule of all Victorian domestic service was that the servant's life existed entirely for the family's convenience. Illness was an inconvenience, exhaustion was a given. The servant was expected to push through both without complaint. There was a certain pride among the staff in enduring hardship without letting it show, but this pride often masked deep resentment. Servants were human after all, and many bristled at the casual way their employers assumed obedience. Mrs. Gray, reflecting on her years as mistress of a large household, admitted to Lionel one evening, "I had good staff because I paid them well and left them alone," which, apparently, made me a radical. Yet for all its hardships, domestic service offered stability that many working-class jobs did not. Wages were low, but room and board were included, and the prestige of working in a good household could open doors later in life. Some servants used their positions to network, quietly cultivating relationships with tradesmen, suppliers, and even distant relatives of the family. Others saved enough to leave service entirely, opening small shops or boarding houses. But the majority remained in service for life, their youth spent in labour, their old age dependent on the charity of former employers or the parish. As the century progressed, the golden age of domestic service began to wane. Industrialization offered other jobs, especially for young women, and the rising middle class could no longer afford the large staffs that had once been the hallmark of respectability. But in the grand houses that remained, the old etiquette endured. The separate staircases, the quiet entrances, the expectation that the servant's presence should be felt only in the smooth running of the household, never in the sound of their voice. In the end, the servants' hall was a world within a world, bound by its own rules, sustained by its own rhythms, and forever shaped by the unbalanced power between those who worked and those who were served. Upstairs, etiquette kept the illusion of refinement alive. Downstairs, it kept the machinery of that illusion running, oiled by sweat, gossip, and the occasional quiet act of rebellion. Next, we'll step away from the domestic sphere entirely and into the art of Victorian conversation, a skill that could elevate your standing or sink it in minutes, all without raising your voice. Chapter 6. The Art of Conversation Without Saying Too Much. If the dining table was the battlefield of Victorian etiquette, then conversation was the sword, elegant, polished, and capable of cutting deep without drawing blood. The Victorians considered conversation not just a social skill, but a moral duty. To speak well was to prove your refinement. To speak badly was to reveal your lack of breeding. And yet, speaking well didn't mean saying anything truly revealing. The paradox of Victorian conversation was that it was meant to be engaging without being personal, clever without being controversial, and flattering without being insincere, though, of course, it often was. The rules were meticulous. You did not interrupt, except in cases of genuine urgency, and even then, urgency usually meant the house catching fire. You did not raise your voice, lest you be mistaken for a market seller. You certainly did not swear, not even the mildest expletive, unless you were prepared to be mentally exiled from polite company. And above all, you never, ever allowed the conversation to stray into the three forbidden territories: politics, religion, and money, which meant that many of the most pressing issues of the day, colonial wars, the Irish question, the working poor, were politely ignored in favor of safer topics like weather, art, or the latest opera performance. This aversion to substance was not accidental. Conversation was a tool for preserving the illusion of harmony, especially in mixed company. To discuss something divisive would be to admit that the world outside the drawing room was not the orderly moral place everyone pretended it was. In that sense, Victorian small talk was a kind of collective self-deception, a way of agreeing that the dirt and unrest outside could be swept neatly under the parlour rug. Mrs. Gray once summed it up to Lionel with a dry smile. "The secret to a good Victorian conversation, my dear, is to talk for an hour without learning a single new thing." For women, conversation was particularly treacherous. A lady was expected to be well read enough to contribute, but never so knowledgeable that she might overshadow the men. Too much wit, and you risked being labelled forward. Too much silence, and you were insipid. The perfect balance was to be charming, attentive, and clever in a way that flattered rather than challenged your companions. Men, on the other hand, were allowed more leeway to display knowledge, but even they had to tread carefully. Boasting was frowned upon, as was excessive seriousness. Both could mark you as socially awkward. Public speaking was a different beast altogether. At social gatherings, a gentleman might be called upon to give a toast or a few words of thanks, and his success depended on brevity and a light touch. A speech that dragged on was considered a sin against the company's patience. For women, public speaking was rarer, and when it did happen, it was usually in the form of reciting poetry or reading a prepared piece of literature, often with all the emotional depth of a tepid cup of tea. The performance valued for its decorum rather than its content. The conversation itself was often built on a structure of mutual compliments. One might admire another's attire, inquire about their family's health in the vaguest possible terms, or praise a recent performance at the theatre. Sincere or not, these exchanges reinforced the idea that society was a place where everyone was well-dressed, well-mannered, and thriving, a pleasant fiction that kept the machinery of politeness running smoothly. The cost of this fiction, of course, was honesty. Real emotions, real frustrations, and real opinions were left unsaid. Of course, the rules were not always followed to the letter. In private, close friends might allow themselves more candour, even straying into the forbidden topics. But such conversations were risky if overheard, and in houses full of servants, nothing was truly private. Gossip, too, thrived in these quieter spaces. While scandal was rarely discussed in the open, hints and allusions could be dropped with surgical precision, allowing listeners to draw their own conclusions. This was the Victorian way of speaking ill without appearing to, an art form in itself. The dark side of all this restraint was that it created a culture where people could spend years in each other's company without ever truly knowing one another. Friendships, and even marriages, could exist almost entirely within the bounds of polite conversation, with neither party daring to venture into the territory of genuine intimacy. It was possible to speak beautifully and say nothing at all, to be socially adored yet emotionally isolated. Lionel, after one particularly dull evening of parlour chatter, confessed to Mrs. Gray that he had learned absolutely nothing about his companions, except that they all agreed the weather had been unseasonably mild. She patted his arm and replied, "And that, my boy, is how you know it was a roaring success. The conversational topics that were safe often bordered on the absurd in their predictability. The latest travel destinations, the condition of the roads, the quality of the season's strawberries, a recent painting at the Royal Academy, all were considered suitable, provided they could be discussed without criticism. Even art, if talked about too boldly, could cause offence. A gentleman might remark that a painting captured the light beautifully, but to suggest that its subject matter was morally questionable would be considered unnecessarily provocative. What's remarkable is how this obsession with verbal restraint existed alongside the era's love of letters and published opinions. The same people who avoided political discussion in the drawing room might write fiery editorials under pseudonyms or devour the latest scandal sheets in private. It was as though there were two versions of every Victorian: the public persona, smooth and immaculate, and the private self, hungry for the very debates and dramas they pretended to shun. In the end, the art of conversation in the Victorian era was less about communication and more about choreography. Every word was placed with care, every sentence polished until it shone, but the shine was often shallow. The point was not to exchange ideas, but to perform civility, to prove one's belonging in a world where manners mattered more than meaning. And like so much of Victorian etiquette, it was a performance that came at the cost of truth. Next, we'll peel back the layers further and look at the peculiar rules of mourning, funerals, and the etiquette of grief, because even death in the Victorian world came with a dress code and a set of social obligations that could outlast the deceased themselves. If conversation in Victorian society was a dance, then the second half of the evening was when everyone began repeating the same steps, just in slightly different shoes. After dinner, the ladies would withdraw to the drawing room, a move framed as a genteel tradition but functioning as a quiet segregation of the sexes. Here, conversation took on an even more delicate form. Without the men present, one might expect candour to flourish, but candour was rarely welcome in polite company, no matter the gender composition. The talk was still bound by the same invisible rules: agreeable topics, gentle voices, and the careful avoidance of anything that might disturb the illusion that all was well. The drawing room itself was often a trap. A lady could not simply sit in silence without appearing dull, nor could she dominate the conversation without seeming arrogant. The safest course was to participate in a kind of verbal embroidery: a few polite remarks, a modest laugh at another's anecdote, a compliment here and there. If a woman was particularly skilled, she might steer the conversation towards subjects where she shone: literature, gardening, music, but always in a way that seemed modest. Any sign that she was showing off would be quietly noted and discussed later, usually in terms that began with, "Of course, she is clever." But, meanwhile, in the smoking room, the men enjoyed a different conversational landscape. Here, the rules loosened slightly. Topics like politics and business might surface, though still tempered by the expectation of civility. It was understood that disagreement should never rise to the level of open hostility, even when discussing matters that could ruin fortunes or provoke public riots. One was expected to smile and pour another brandy. Sarcasm and wit were welcome tools, provided they were wielded with precision and without drawing actual blood. Lionel, who had once stumbled into a smoking room debate about the railways, emerged pale and determined never to do it again. It was like watching men duel with butter knives, he told Mrs. Gray. They were too polite to cut, but determined to win anyway. When the groups rejoined, the evening entered its final conversational phase, the gentle wind down. Now was the time for light, safe topics: the arrangement of flowers in the garden, the latest charitable subscription list, perhaps a mild jest about the unpredictability of London weather. If someone had played the piano earlier, there might be a compliment or two about the performance, carefully phrased so as not to suggest overfamiliarity. The goal was to leave the house with your dignity intact and your social standing unshaken, ideally having said nothing memorable enough to be repeated inaccurately the next day. It's worth noting that in a culture so obsessed with verbal restraint, the silences carried as much weight as the words. A pause in conversation could be a weapon. a way of signaling disapproval without open confrontation. A polite smile in response to a comment could communicate either agreement or quiet mockery, depending on the tilt of the head and the flicker in the eyes. In this way, conversation became a subtle form of combat, where the most skilled could land blows that the untrained ear never noticed. Mrs. Gray was a master of this art, her gentle, indeed, capable of conveying anything from polite interest to withering disdain. The unspoken reality was that most people knew the difference between polite conversation and truth. The truth lived elsewhere, in whispered exchanges on balconies, in hurried notes slipped into coat pockets, in the unguarded moments when no one was listening. But those moments were rare, because in the Victorian world you were almost never unobserved. Servants moved quietly in the background, guests came and went, and even family members were potential gossips. It created a society where privacy was not just scarce, but actively discouraged. The suppression of honest speech had its costs. Misunderstandings festered, grievances were swallowed, and relationships often remained shallow, despite years of acquaintance. People learned to judge each other not by the content of their words, but by their skill in delivering them. A person could be respected for being agreeable, without anyone actually liking them. It was a kind of social theatre, where the performance mattered more than the performer's sincerity. And as with all theatre, the audience could be fickle. One misjudged remark could close the curtain on your reputation for good. Of course, there were those who broke the rules, intentionally or not. The eccentric old aunt who brought up politics at the tea table, the blunt colonial cousin who discussed business profits in mixed company, the idealistic young woman who dared to question the morality of empire. These were the conversational disruptors. They were both feared and secretly admired, for they had the courage to say what others only thought. But courage in conversation was dangerous. It could lead to social exile faster than financial ruin. The great irony was that while Victorians cultivated conversation as a refined art, the substance of that art often boiled down to avoiding anything of real importance. The skill lay in speaking without offending, entertaining without revealing, and passing an entire evening in the company of others, while keeping one's true opinions locked firmly away. It was a performance in which everyone knew their lines, and ad-libbing was rarely rewarded. By the end of the night, as carriages pulled away and the last good nights were exchanged, most guests could not recall exactly what had been said, only whether the evening had been pleasant. And in Victorian society, pleasant was the highest praise a conversation could earn. The fact that it often meant nothing happened was beside the point. Next, we'll move into one of the most rigidly codified and strangely revealing aspects of Victorian etiquette: mourning, funerals, and the elaborate etiquette of grief, because in this era, even death was no escape from the rules. Chapter 7. Mourning, Funerals, and the Etiquette of Grief. If you think grief is one of the few moments in life when society might give you a break, the Victorians would like to politely disagree. For them, even mourning came with rules. Strict, suffocating rules that dictated exactly what you wore, how long you wore it, who you could see, and what you could say. Death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a public performance, and the role you played wasn't about your feelings. It was about how convincingly you could signal those feelings to the rest of the world, preferably in black crepe. Queen Victoria herself set the tone, famously retreating into decades of mourning after the death of her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861. She wore black for the rest of her life, which in Victorian logic somehow became the gold standard for devotion. If the monarch did it, then surely any respectable widow should at least attempt the same, even if it meant looking like a shadow at every social gathering for years. The Queen's personal grief became a national template, and mourning fashion, already elaborate, expanded into an entire industry. For women, the rules were particularly exacting. Full mourning for a widow lasted 2 years. The first year in matte black fabrics with no sheen or ornamentation. The second year in slightly less severe attire, sometimes allowing muted trims or a touch of white lace. Only after this could a widow move into half mourning, which allowed somber shades like grey, lavender, or mauve. And yes, mauve had its own tragic glamour in Victorian society, thanks in part to the fact that the first synthetic mauve dye became fashionable around the same time. A widow in mauve was still signalling loss, but also suggesting she might eventually rejoin the living. Men had it far easier. A black suit, a cravat, and perhaps a black armband sufficed. Their mourning period was shorter, their clothing less expensive, and their social restrictions lighter. In practice, a widower could be seen at dinners and public events long before a widow would dare to reappear without risking scandal. It was yet another example of how etiquette claimed to promote morality, but in reality maintained unequal expectations. Mrs. the Sand Grey, ever the observer, once said to Lionel, "A man may wear mourning for 3 months and be praised for his stoicism. A woman who does the same is whispered about as heartless." Mourning wasn't just about clothing, it was about behaviour. The bereaved were expected to withdraw from most forms of entertainment for a prescribed period. A widow in deep mourning would not attend balls, the theatre, or even large dinner parties. Calling cards were edged in black to signal the bereavement, and replies to invitations might be written in black ink. These were visual cues that allowed others to navigate the minefield of social interaction. It would be terribly gauche, after all, to invite someone in deep mourning to a lively musical evening. Funerals themselves were performances of their own. The scale of the event reflected the deceased's social standing, with elaborate hearses drawn by black-plumed horses, long processions, and a hierarchy of mourners. Professional mourners could be hired to ensure the turnout looked suitably grand. This may sound grotesque, but in an age when appearances mattered above all, a well-populated funeral was a sign that the deceased had lived and died with respectability. Even the order in which people walked in the procession was dictated by status and relation, with strict instructions to avoid any unseemly jostling for position. The mourning industry thrived under these conditions. Shops specialized in black fabrics. Jewelers produced mourning rings containing locks of the deceased's hair, and photographers offered memorial portraits, sometimes taken after death, with the body carefully posed to look as if asleep. By modern standards, these post-mortem photographs can be unsettling, but for Victorians they were treasured keepsakes, especially in an era when few families could afford frequent photography while their loved ones were alive. The darker truth behind all this was that the rituals of mourning often had little to do with genuine grief. For some, they were an opportunity to display wealth and taste, to show that the family could afford the finest black silk and the grandest floral arrangements. For others, they were a social obligation, an exhausting and costly one. Working-class families often went into debt to provide an appropriate funeral, fearful of the judgment that would follow anything less. It was not uncommon for households to sell belongings or borrow heavily to meet these expectations, turning grief into financial strain. There was also the peculiar cruelty of public scrutiny. People in mourning were watched closely for any sign of inappropriate cheerfulness. A smile in the wrong context could spark gossip. A public outing too soon after the funeral could lead to whispered accusations of indifference. It wasn't enough to feel grief. You had to perform it convincingly for as long as etiquette demanded, and heaven help you if you actually began to recover before the prescribed time had elapsed. Lionel once recounted to Mrs. Grey the story of a young widow who had been spotted laughing at a garden party 6 months after her husband's death. "Scandalous," Mrs. Grey replied dryly. "Imagine, she forgot to be miserable on schedule." Still, the rituals provided structure, and for some, comfort. The clear rules gave the bereaved something to hold on to when the rest of life felt uncertain. Dressing in mourning attire was a visible way to express loss without needing to articulate it. The black crepe became a kind of shield, warding off unwanted social demands and signaling to the world that one's life had changed. But the shield could also become a prison, especially for women, who were expected to remain inside it far longer than men. By the late 19th century, the rigidity of mourning etiquette began to soften. The Industrial Revolution had brought faster fashion cycles, and not everyone was willing to spend years in somber dress. Some reformers criticized the excesses of mourning culture as morbid or financially wasteful, and as the century turned, the idea that grief should be expressed so publicly and so uniformly began to seem outdated. But in the height of the Victorian era, mourning was as much about maintaining the social order as it was about honouring the dead. Next, we'll step into the murky territory of those who dared to break the rules, intentionally or accidentally, and what happened when Victorian etiquette met deliberate defiance. If the first half of Victorian mourning etiquette was about slipping into the uniform of grief, the second half was about surviving inside it, often for far longer than actual sorrow demanded. Once the funeral was over and the black crepe settled around you like a second skin, the real work began, performing your loss to an audience that expected consistency, restraint, and a level of emotional endurance that bordered on theatrical. There was no room for bad days in the wrong direction. If you were too distraught, you risked being called hysterical. Too composed, and you were cold-hearted. The perfect mourner lived in the narrow space between dignified sadness and emotional availability, and kept it up for months, sometimes years. Widows bore the heaviest burden. During full mourning, she was expected to avoid any display of pleasure. No theatre, no dancing, no brightly coloured clothing, no social calls that might seem frivolous. Even walking in the park could be suspect if she was seen smiling at an acquaintance. In smaller towns, where everyone knew everyone's business, the scrutiny could be suffocating. People timed how quickly a widow lifted her veil to speak with a neighbour, or counted the weeks before she resumed Sunday visits. In some cases, the local gossip could be harsher than any formal breach of etiquette, because it was personal. Mrs. Gray once told Lionel of a woman whose greatest crime was letting herself be seen buying a bolt of patterned fabric too soon after her husband's death. The man was a brute, Mrs. Gray remarked, but apparently his memory deserved solid black until the sun went cold. Men's mourning, meanwhile, remained astonishingly brief and undemanding. A widower might wear a black armband for a few months, perhaps a dark suit, and limit his social outings for a short period before returning to normal life, sometimes with alarming speed. A second marriage within a year wasn't uncommon, especially if children were involved. Society often framed this as practical, or even romantic. The man unable to bear life without female companionship. No such grace was extended to women. A widow remarrying within a year risked being labelled shameless, as though her grief had an officially sanctioned expiry date she had willfully ignored. Mourning wasn't just a set of clothes and rules. It was an economic ecosystem. Dressmakers specialized in mourning attire, milliners in veils and hats, jewelers in jet brooches and hairwork lockets. The production of black fabrics alone became a significant part of the textile industry. Poorer families, unable to afford the full wardrobe of mourning, sometimes dyed existing clothes black, a process that could leave fabrics stiff, smelly, and unpleasant to wear. Others resorted to renting mourning clothes, a business model that thrived in urban centres. In these cases, grief became literally commodified, measured in rental fees and dye costs. The obsession with propriety extended to correspondence. Letters of condolence were a required social gesture, and they followed a formal style, restrained, dignified, never overly familiar. The bereaved were expected to respond, even if only with a brief acknowledgement written in black-edged stationery. For someone deep in actual grief, this could feel like a bureaucratic nightmare, sorting through messages from people they barely knew, thanking them for sympathies that sometimes felt more like social obligations than genuine comfort. But failure to follow through risked offence, and offence risked social standing. And then there were the rituals of memorialization. Families commissioned portraits of the deceased, sometimes idealized, sometimes incorporating post-mortem photography to capture one last likeness. Locks of hair might be woven into jewelry, framed or sewn into keepsakes. For the wealthy, elaborate monuments and mausoleums served as permanent public statements of grief and of financial capability. Even in death, status spoke loudly. The working classes, lacking the means for such displays, often expressed mourning through smaller, portable items. A locket, a brooch, or a photograph kept in a hidden pocket. The emotional reality beneath these rituals was complex. For some, the structured etiquette of mourning offered a sense of order in the chaos of loss. The rituals provided something to do, decisions to make, a timetable to follow. But for others, the demands of public grief became a second wound. Being watched so closely while trying to recover could make healing harder, trapping the bereaved in a cycle where appearances mattered more than emotions. And the irony was that genuine grief didn't always align with the prescribed calendar. Some people never wanted to take off their mourning clothes. Others were ready to return to normal life long before etiquette allowed. Neither response fit neatly into the system. By the end of the 19th century, cracks in the mourning culture began to appear. The sheer cost and inconvenience of the rituals, combined with changing social attitudes, led some to quietly shorten mourning periods or relax the rules. But for much of the Victorian era, the etiquette of grief remained one of the most rigid aspects of social life, a reminder that even in moments of deepest personal pain, the performance of propriety took precedence. Lionel, ever the observer, once remarked to Mrs. Gray after attending a particularly lavish funeral, "It felt less like a farewell and more like a parade." She nodded, adjusting her black gloves. "That's because it was, dear boy. And, as with all parades, it's less about where you're going and more about who sees you getting there." Next, we'll step into the territory of the rule breakers, those who ignored, bent, or outright mocked Victorian etiquette, and the scandalous, sometimes entertaining, consequences they faced. Chapter 8. Breaking the rules and paying the price. If Victorian etiquette was a fortress, it wasn't entirely impenetrable. Now and then, someone would slip through the gates, intentionally or by accident, and the results were rarely quiet. Breaking the rules of this era was not the same as forgetting to say please at the dinner table today. It could mean the loss of social standing, friendships, marriage prospects, and in some cases, your livelihood. The danger was real, but so was the temptation. For every rigid rule, there was someone who decided that life was too short or too dull to follow it. And when those people misstepped, society was there to watch, whisper, and judge. Some breaches were almost petty by modern standards. A lady appearing in public without gloves, for example, could be read as careless at best and suggestive at worst. The absence of gloves wasn't just about fashion. It hinted at a lack of self-restraint, as if uncovered hands were a gateway to uncovered morals. Men, too, were vulnerable to small slips. A gentleman removing his hat in the wrong place, or addressing someone without the proper title, could be accused of arrogance or ignorance, both equally damning in the eyes of the polite world. But there were bigger scandals, the kind that filled drawing rooms with delicious whispers for weeks. Marriages across class lines, for example, were considered not just impractical, but vaguely indecent, as though affection itself was suspicious if it ignored the hierarchy. A wealthy heiress marrying a man without land or title might find herself socially exiled, while a titled gentleman marrying a shopkeeper's daughter would be pitied as having thrown himself away. Mrs. Theirs. Gray recalled one such match from her youth with a wicked gleam in her eye. She married for love, poor girl. They said it would never last, and it didn't. But the marriage failed only after the gossip had run out of steam, which is really the important thing. There were also those who deliberately flouted convention for sport. These were the eccentrics, often shielded by wealth or family influence, who could thumb their noses at etiquette without losing their place. An aristocratic widow might dress in bright colours a mere 6 months into mourning, claiming she found black depressing. A well-connected gentleman might swear in the presence of ladies, making them blush and earning himself a reputation for worldliness rather than vulgarity. The hypocrisy was blatant. The same actions that would ruin a person of lesser means could be shrugged off as charming quirks when performed by the elite. For women without the protection of fortune, rebellion was a much riskier business. Speaking too freely, travelling unchaperoned, or engaging in public debate could tarnish a reputation beyond repair. The early suffragists knew this all too well. Their very presence at political meetings was considered an affront to propriety. Critics painted them as unwomanly, dangerous, even unhinged. And yet, these women persisted, knowing that breaking the rules was the only way to change them. They became a kind of counterpoint to the demure ideal, proving that a woman could have both a mind and a voice, even if society preferred she keep both hidden. Some rule-breaking was unintentional, born of ignorance rather than defiance. A colonial visitor might unknowingly breach London's intricate calling card etiquette, leaving a folded card when an unfolded one was required, or failing to respond to an invitation in time. Such mistakes could be forgiven, or not, depending on the mood of the host. But even genuine misunderstandings could linger in memory, resurfacing months later in conversation with that faintly amused, "Of course, they're not quite accustomed to our ways." Translation: we will never let them forget it. And then there were the private transgressions that became public. Affairs, gambling debts, drunken escapades. These were the breaches that could not be smoothed over with polite excuses, though the consequences still depended heavily on who had committed them. A titled man might be quietly sent abroad for a season until the scandal cooled. A woman, especially a married one, could find herself effectively erased from polite society, her name omitted from guest lists, and her friends suddenly too busy to call. Lionel, ever the optimist, once remarked to Mrs. Gray that such punishment seemed harsh. She gave him a look over the rim of her teacup and said, "My dear boy, you can survive a broken heart in this world, but a broken reputation will finish you." The fascination with rule breakers was almost as strong as the condemnation. People might tut and shake their heads, but they also leaned in to hear every detail. Scandal was a form of social entertainment, a way for the respectable to experience a vicarious thrill while reaffirming their own moral superiority. It was a safe rebellion. Theirs happened in whispers, not in deeds. And perhaps that was the most Victorian hypocrisy of all, publicly upholding the fortress of etiquette, while privately enjoying every brick that came loose. In the end, breaking the rules in the Victorian era was less about the act itself, and more about who you were when you did it. The poor could be punished for breathing the wrong way, while the rich could sip champagne in a ballroom dressed entirely in last season's scandal and still receive polite bows. The system was designed not to uphold morality, but to protect its architects. Those who forgot that found out, often painfully, that the fortress had no mercy for the uninvited. Next, we'll look at what happened when rule-breaking went beyond scandal and began to chip away at the etiquette system itself, a slow unravelling that would eventually change the social fabric of Britain. If scandal in the Victorian era was a kind of sport, then the second act was always the long, drawn-out aftermath, the slow social erosion that followed the initial explosion of whispers. Rule-breaking didn't always kill a person's place in society overnight. Often, it worked more like dry rot, invisible at first, but spreading beneath the surface until, one day, the whole structure gave way. Sometimes the fall was swift, sometimes it took years. But once it began, it was almost impossible to reverse. One of the most common fates for a rule breaker was the quiet freeze. This was a social punishment so polite it almost seemed accidental. Invitations simply stopped arriving. People became indisposed whenever you suggested calling. Your name was no longer mentioned in the right rooms, and when it did come up, it was met with a change of subject so smooth you could almost believe you'd imagined it. This was not the dramatic exile of novels. No screaming, no public denunciation. Instead, you faded from the scene, your absence explained away as though you'd chosen to retire. For the ambitious, this was far crueler than confrontation. At least being denounced gave you a chance to defend yourself. The freeze gave you nothing but silence. The more dramatic punishments were reserved for those whose rule-breaking struck directly at the moral theatre of the time. A woman caught in adultery, for example, could be divorced, a legal process so expensive and humiliating that it might as well have been public execution for her social life. Newspapers loved these cases, publishing juicy details under the guise of public interest. For men, the same offence might be quietly handled, with the guilty party sent away on a conveniently timed business trip. The hypocrisy was so blatant it almost became invisible, hidden in plain sight behind the shield of double standards. Some people, of course, leaned into their new reputations. Once the fortress of etiquette had expelled them, they no longer felt bound by its rules. These were the true social renegades, the women who took lovers openly, the men who gambled and drank without apology, the writers who skewered the very world they'd once courted. Their freedom was intoxicating to watch, but dangerous to emulate. Most lacked the resources to survive outside the fortress. Without money, connections, or a patron, life on the margins of respectable society was far less romantic than it sounded. It was here that the Victorian press played its most insidious role. Newspapers and illustrated magazines thrived on the tension between reverence for propriety and fascination with its breakdown. Scandals sold, and editors knew exactly how to feed the public's appetite without openly admitting it. A fallen woman might be described in lurid detail, her fashion choices, facial expressions, and supposed moral failings dissected in print. Men in disgrace were treated with more restraint, often framed as tragically flawed rather than willfully corrupt. In this way, the press both upheld and undermined the etiquette it claimed to revere, using scandal to reinforce the very social order it pretended to challenge. The irony was that sometimes breaking the rules could actually make you more famous, and even, in certain cases, more desirable. There was a particular allure to the dangerous figure, the one who had thumbed their nose at convention and survived. These individuals became the subject of hushed admiration, even imitation, though always at a safe distance. It was as if they had stolen a taste of forbidden fruit, and society wanted to watch them eat it without getting caught themselves. Mrs. B. Gray once observed to Lionel, "Half the people who scold the loudest would do the same if they thought they could get away with it. The other half already have, and they're just better at hiding it." Still, the risk remained. For every social renegade who managed to maintain a certain charm, there were dozens who slipped into obscurity, their names preserved only in cautionary tales. Sometimes the punishment was generational. The children of a disgraced figure could find themselves excluded from the opportunities their parents had enjoyed. In this way, Victorian etiquette extended its reach beyond the individual, ensuring that the lesson of obedience was passed down through fear as much as through habit. Yet, in the cracks of the fortress walls, something else began to grow. By the later decades of the 19th century, more and more people were questioning whether the elaborate codes of conduct were worth preserving at all. Industrialists who had made their own fortunes cared less about who someone's grandparents were. Women's movements began to challenge the double standards of morality. Writers and satirists skewered the absurdities of etiquette in popular fiction, making it harder for the rules to be taken entirely seriously. The fortress was still standing, but hairline fractures were spreading. It was in these shifting times that the act of breaking the rules began to change meaning. In the early Victorian period, it was simply rebellion. By the end, it could be a statement, even a badge of identity. But the price for that badge remained high, and not everyone could afford to wear it. For every person who defied the system and thrived, countless others paid with their reputations, their social connections, and their futures. By the turn of the century, etiquette would no longer hold the same unchallenged authority. But, in the thick of the Victorian years, breaking the rules was still an act of social suicide for most, and a performance for the rest. Next, we'll move into the slow, deliberate unravelling of Victorian etiquette itself, and how the very forces that once upheld it began to quietly dismantle it from within. Chapter 9. The Slow Death of Victorian Etiquette. Every fortress eventually crumbles. not because someone storms the gates in a blaze of glory, but because time, weather, and a little bit of neglect start eating at the foundations. Victorian etiquette, for all its pomp and polish, was no exception. By the late 19th century, the cracks were showing. The fortress still stood, tall, proud, and as self-assured as ever. But inside, the pillars were shifting. The society that had once relied on etiquette as its invisible scaffolding was beginning to change, and the rules that had once seemed unshakable were starting to feel like antique furniture in a modern house. Beautiful, yes, but bulky and slightly in the way. The Industrial Revolution was one of the chief wrecking balls. With it came new wealth, and new people who didn't care nearly as much about which fork to use for the fish course. Self-made industrialists had money, influence, and in many cases, no interest in tiptoeing through the old labyrinth of manners. They built grand houses and hosted lavish dinners, but they weren't about to waste decades learning the subtle art of bowing at precisely the right angle. In fact, part of their appeal was that they didn't. They poured champagne with their own hands, laughed loudly, and sometimes committed the unforgivable sin of speaking about business at the table. And yet, the old guard found themselves having to tolerate it, because these people had something even more important than breeding: cash. At the same time, the British Empire was changing the way people saw the world. Exposure to other cultures, sometimes through travel, more often through colonial expansion, brought new ideas about dress, food, and even social customs. Some of these influences crept into British high society in the form of exotic fabrics, foreign dishes, or new forms of entertainment. Of course, Victorians still managed to filter these through their own sense of superiority, often cherry-picking what looked glamorous while ignoring the realities behind it. But even this selective adoption chipped away at the old idea that only British tradition was proper tradition. The women's movement was another force, loosening the mortar between the bricks. Suffragists and reformers were not content to stay within the conversational boundaries of gardening and music. They pushed political issues into drawing rooms, wrote public letters, and began speaking at gatherings where women were not supposed to speak at all. Even among women who weren't active in politics, there was a growing awareness that the endless dance of courtship and domestic service to one's husband wasn't the only possible life path. The bicycle, oddly enough, became a symbol of this shift, giving women both mobility and a physical freedom their corsets and floor-length skirts had long denied them. Every turn of the wheel rolled them a little further from the fortress walls. Technology played its part too. The expansion of railways made travel faster, and with it, the mixing of people who might never otherwise meet. A London businessman could find himself seated across from a factory owner's wife in a train carriage, and conversation, real conversation, without chaperones or the familiar safety net of introductions, might happen before etiquette could interfere. The telegraph, and later the telephone, began to shrink the world, making communication more immediate and less formal. A world in which you could send a message in minutes didn't pair neatly with a society that expected 3 days' delay for a proper handwritten reply. The press was quietly subversive as well. Newspapers were increasingly affordable and more widely read, and not all of them cared about maintaining the old social code. Satirical magazines poked fun at etiquette's absurdities, lampooning the obsession with place cards and mourning veils. Caricatures showed overdressed ladies toppling under the weight of their own hats, or pompous gentlemen drowning in their own overcomplicated greetings. Even those who followed the rules could not entirely escape the creeping realization that, perhaps, the whole thing was a bit silly. Mrs. Gray, who had lived long enough to see the first hairline fractures in the system, told Lionel over tea one afternoon, "It's not that the young ones don't know the rules anymore, it's that they know them and choose not to care. And once people stop caring, the rules are already half dead." Lionel, ever cautious, asked if she thought the death of etiquette would be a good thing. She stirred her tea and replied, "Good for some, terrible for others. You take away the rules, and suddenly everyone has to survive on their own charm. That's a tall order in this country." The truth was, Etiquette had always been a double-edged sword. It could protect the socially vulnerable, giving them a clear set of behaviours that would allow them to move without offence. But it could also be a cage, keeping those same people from speaking, acting, or even dressing in ways that reflected their true selves. As society became more fluid, the cage began to feel less like protection and more like a relic of a time when everyone knew their place and stayed there. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden. There was no single day when the bow was deemed obsolete or the calling card vanished. Instead, the rules simply began to erode in practice. People still dressed for dinner, but perhaps with less precision. A hostess might forgive a late reply to an invitation if the guest was modern or busy. Even the all-important seating arrangements became more flexible, and as these small breaches went unpunished, they set precedents. By the final years of the century, the fortress of Victorian etiquette still looked formidable from a distance, but anyone who walked its halls could feel the air shifting, fresher, lighter, carrying the faint scent of change. Those who clung tightly to the old ways pretended not to notice, but deep down they knew the architecture was weakening. The world outside was moving too quickly, and no amount of crepe, calling cards, or curtsies could slow it down. Next, we'll step into the final act, how the last years of the Victorian era quietly prepared the stage for the new social order of the Edwardian age, and how the fortress finally learned it could be left behind. By the closing years of the 19th century, the slow decline of Victorian etiquette wasn't just visible to those paying attention. It was quietly being discussed over tea, hinted at in society columns, and whispered about in drawing rooms. The conversations weren't direct. Victorians still preferred to wrap even the topic of change in layers of politeness. Instead of saying, "The rules are dying," they'd murmur something like, "Well, things do seem rather different than they were in my youth," or, "It's curious how little attention the younger generation pays to such matters." Behind the genteel tone, however, was a dawning awareness that the fortress of manners no longer stood unchallenged. One of the clearest signs was the shift in public gatherings. The once rigid structure of formal dinners was loosening. There were still menus printed in French, crystal glasses for each type of wine, and silver cutlery arranged like an arsenal on either side of the plate, but the mood was less severe. Conversation was broader, laughter louder, and, shockingly, some guests even dared to arrive a few minutes late without being socially executed. This wasn't outright rebellion. No one was storming into the dining room wearing a smoking jacket before dessert, but it was a noticeable relaxation. And once relaxation sets in, formality is on borrowed time. The younger generation was particularly adept at bending the rules without technically breaking them. They would attend the right events, wear the expected clothes, and make the appropriate greetings, but the sincerity was fading. They curtsied as if they were ticking a box, bowed like they were marking attendance, and their polite smiles were often paired with a glint in the eye that said, "We're doing this because we have to, not because we believe in it." The performance remained, but the belief that etiquette was the lifeblood of civilization was weakening, and that for a tradition is far deadlier than outright defiance. The hypocrisy of the system was also becoming harder to ignore. Industrialists who lacked pedigreed ancestry were being welcomed into the highest circles purely for their wealth, while older families quietly adjusted the rules to accommodate them. It turned out that a sufficiently large donation to the right charitable cause, or the financing of a new wing at a city hospital, could smooth over almost any breach of manners. Etiquette, which had long been presented as a moral code, was revealing itself more plainly as a tool of convenience, something that could be enforced or relaxed depending on who was involved and what they could offer. Mrs. Gray, who had lived long enough to spot a shift before most others, found herself half amused and half appalled. "We're not losing the rules because the young have stopped caring," she told Lionel one afternoon. "We're losing them because the rich have decided they're optional. And when the rich decide something's optional, it doesn't stay compulsory for long." Lionel, ever the cautious observer, replied, "So it's not rebellion, it's just selective amnesia?" She smirked. "Exactly. A very genteel forgetting." Public amusements were also changing the landscape. Theatres, music halls, and exhibitions were attracting audiences from multiple classes, forcing people to share public space in a way that made strict social separation difficult to maintain. You couldn't enforce rules about who was allowed to sit next to whom in a crowded music hall, not without turning the whole place into a farce. People were mingling more, speaking more, and in the process, realizing that much of what they'd been told about proper company was exaggerated or outright nonsense. Once you've laughed at the same bad joke in a theatre with someone beneath you, it becomes harder to pretend they don't exist. The growing influence of the press was another nail in the coffin. Satirical magazines like Punch thrived on lampooning the absurdities of high society. Cartoons depicted pompous dinner hosts, overdressed ladies, and the kind of suffocating formality that made even readers who'd never attended such events feel in on the joke. When you can buy mockery of etiquette for a penny on the street corner, the aura of untouchable dignity begins to look suspiciously fragile. And then there was the matter of practicality. The pace of life was accelerating. Railways, telegrams, and international trade were making the world more connected, but also more impatient. Waiting 3 days to reply to a letter, as etiquette demanded, seemed increasingly silly when you could send a telegram in minutes. Social calls that once lasted hours became half-hour affairs. Invitations no longer had to be hand-delivered by a liveried servant. They could arrive by post, cheaper, faster, and far less ceremonious. The machinery of modern life was grinding against the gears of old-fashioned courtesy, and the old system was losing ground. Of course, not everyone was pleased with this shift. The staunch defenders of etiquette, usually older, wealthier, and comfortably insulated from the harsher realities of life, decried the sloppiness of modern manners. They predicted social collapse, moral decay, and the inevitable end of civilized society. Ironically, these were often the same people who had quietly bent the rules when it suited them. Their laments, while sincere in tone, rang a little hollow. By the century's end, the death of Victorian etiquette was still more of a rumour than a headline. The forms were still there, the dinners, the calling cards, the dances, but the life had gone out of them. What remained was more habit than belief, the shell of a system whose foundation had already been eroded. The real question wasn't whether etiquette would survive into the new century. It was what would replace it when it finally fell. In the next and final chapter, we'll watch the Victorian fortress of manners give way to a new, looser social order, one that promised freedom but carried its own contradictions, and where the ghosts of old etiquette would continue to haunt the living in unexpected ways. Chapter 10. Ghosts in the Parlour. When the calendar finally tipped over into the 20th century, Victorian etiquette didn't vanish with the stroke of midnight. It lingered, like the scent of furniture polish in a room no one uses anymore. Still there, still recognizable, but increasingly irrelevant to daily life. The grand rituals of calling cards, morning dress, and precise table settings were fading, yet their shadows stretched well into the Edwardian years, haunting parlours and drawing rooms like uninvited guests who simply refused to take the hint and leave. The new century brought with it a restlessness. People were moving faster, talking louder, and daring to think that perhaps the measure of a person wasn't the sharpness of their bow or the whiteness of their gloves, but their ideas, ambitions, and, whisper it, their usefulness. The fortress of manners that had once defined social life was now a cracked monument, a tourist attraction of sorts, where the curious could still visit to see how things used to be, but few wanted to actually live inside. Yet even in its decline, etiquette had a strange grip. Some clung to it out of nostalgia, others out of fear of what might replace it. After all, the rules had provided a clear, if suffocating, structure. Without them, how would you know whether you'd just offended someone? How would you know if your place in the world was secure? There was an odd comfort in being told exactly how to sit, stand, speak, and eat, even if you chafed under it. Lionel, now in his 30s, found himself in the middle of this social shift. He'd grown up with the rules, absorbed them without question as a young man, and yet now he watched them crumble with something between relief and mild panic. "It's as if the floor's being taken up," he remarked to Mrs. Gray over tea one blustery January afternoon. "The old boards were creaky, but you knew where to step. Now it's just bare earth, and everyone's tracking mud everywhere." Mrs. Gray, older and sharper than ever, smiled in that knowing way of hers. "Ah, but bare earth can grow new things, Lionel. Old floors only rot if you leave them too long." For many, the loosening of etiquette felt liberating. Women could speak more freely in mixed company without the immediate recoil of scandal. Men could address each other with less formality and still be taken seriously. Social gatherings became less about ritual and more about conversation. The idea that one might attend a dinner without a formal printed menu would have horrified a proper Victorian hostess. But now, it was becoming not only acceptable, but fashionable. Guests could serve themselves, pick and choose courses, and, the horror, even return for seconds without a servant hovering over them. Of course, not everyone handled this freedom gracefully. There were social casualties. Those who, without the safety net of clear rules, floundered in uncertainty. Some became over-familiar too quickly, blurring lines of decorum in ways that made others uncomfortable. Others simply withdrew, preferring the predictable discomfort of the old ways to the unpredictable discomfort of the new. And there were still plenty of people who looked at the shifting landscape and saw nothing but chaos. To them, manners weren't just about forks and hats. They were the backbone of civilization. Without them, they predicted, society would descend into a noisy, shapeless mess. In truth, the mess was simply reality, stripped of its varnish. The Victorian system had always been messy underneath, filled with contradictions, hypocrisy, and a rigid class structure that pretended to be about moral worth, but was really about protecting privilege. Now that the scaffolding was being dismantled, the mess was out in the open for all to see. People still judged each other, still formed cliques, still excluded outsiders. They were just more obvious about it. The Edwardian years would try to maintain a veneer of grace, but it was a thinner, more flexible version. Formal dress and polite greetings persisted, but they no longer carried the weight of moral judgment they once had. A gentleman might shake your hand instead of bowing, and you could survive the encounter without losing social standing. Women's clothing began to loosen, literally, as corsets were worn less tightly, and skirts rose ever so slightly off the floor. Even the art of conversation changed, moving away from rigid scripts toward a more relaxed, if still cautious, exchange of ideas. The ghosts of Victorian etiquette still appeared, of course. They haunted the phrases people used, the instinctive pauses before speaking, the way a certain kind of hostess still insisted on arranging the seating by rank. They lived in the letters that began, "My dear sir," instead of "hello," and in the way certain people would still never dream of starting a meal before the host had lifted their fork. But they were ghosts, fading, insubstantial, unable to command obedience the way they once had. It's easy, from our modern vantage point, to mock Victorian manners, to see them as fussy, ridiculous, and hopelessly outdated. And they were all of those things. But they were also the scaffolding of an entire society, one that believed, however misguidedly, that manners could keep chaos at bay. In that sense, their passing marked more than just a change in how people dressed or addressed one another. It was the end of an era in which civility was defined by performance, and the beginning of one in which it would have to be defined by something far more complicated: sincerity. In our next and final segment, we'll see just how these ghosts of etiquette lingered, and how, in subtle and surprising ways, they still manage to haunt us even now. Even after the official obituary of Victorian etiquette had been written in whispers and printed between the lines of society pages, its influence clung stubbornly to the early 20th century, like dust in the folds of heavy velvet curtains. The world was stepping into modernity, but the habits, postures, and reflexes of the Victorian age refused to go quietly. They lingered in the same way the smell of coal smoke hangs in the air long after the fire has gone out, faint but undeniable. You could still see it at formal dinners, where guests instinctively reached for the correct fork, even when no one was watching. as though afraid that some ghostly butler would materialize and swat their hands for taking the wrong utensil. The old rules persisted in letter writing too. Even the most forward-thinking correspondent struggled to abandon "My dear madam" for the blunt shock of "Dear Mrs. Bexamer-Z's and so-and-so." These weren't rules anyone enforced anymore. They were habits drilled so deep that they'd become part of muscle memory, a kind of social muscle that twitched without conscious thought. And yet, while the forms remained, the meaning had slipped away. Etiquette had once been a currency, a way to measure, trade, and display social worth. Now it was more like an old set of coins, kept in a drawer for sentimental value, but no longer accepted anywhere. People still paid lip service to manners, but they no longer shaped the core of social life. They were an accessory, not the main garment. Of course, there were diehards. Some elderly hostesses continued to run their households like Victorian time capsules, insisting on separate parlours for men and women after dinner, printed menus in French, and black tie for even the smallest gatherings. These bastions of formality were both admired and ridiculed. Younger guests attended out of curiosity or familial obligation, then went home to laugh about the absurdities over cigarettes and gramophone records. The divide between generations was widening, and with it, the realization that Victorian manners were not immortal truths, but choices that could be unchosen. The irony was that while the Victorians had claimed etiquette was about moral decency, its collapse revealed how much of it had been about optics. When the pressure to maintain appearances lessened, many discovered they could be perfectly civil without knowing the difference between a fish fork and a salad fork. In fact, some found themselves warmer and more genuine in conversation when they weren't mentally calculating whether they'd committed a social faux pas. In this sense, the death of Victorian etiquette was also the birth of something messier, but arguably more honest. Still, the ghosts adapted. They didn't disappear so much as change costumes. The rigid dress codes of the Victorian ballroom might have faded, but dress expectations lived on in new forms: business suits, uniforms, evening gowns for the right events. The language softened, but hierarchy persisted in subtler ways, in who got invited, who got ignored, and who was made to wait for a reply. Human beings are endlessly inventive when it comes to maintaining invisible walls. The Victorians had just been honest enough to build theirs in plain sight. Mrs. Grey, well into her final years, had the privilege of observing the shift with a kind of detached amusement. "We haven't abandoned etiquette," she told Lionel one spring afternoon, sipping tea in a sunlit garden rather than a stuffy drawing room. "We've simply dressed it in looser clothes. It's still here, only now we pretend it's not." Lionel nodded, though he wasn't sure whether she meant that as a compliment or a warning. "So," he said, "we're haunted?" She smiled. "Oh yes, but some ghosts are worth keeping around. They remind us not to become completely unbearable." The most curious part of this haunting was how selective it was. Certain Victorian rules survived, not because they made sense, but because they were charming. The exchange of thank you notes, the courtesy of standing when someone entered the room, the small ritual of offering tea to a guest, these lingered because they were gestures people liked, not because they were afraid of the social guillotine. Meanwhile, the harsher, more exclusionary rules, the endless ranking, the obsession with knowing one's place, slowly crumbled away, or at least they moved out of sight, into the subtler games of status that the new century was eager to play. It would be tempting to declare that the world was better off without the old etiquette, but that's not entirely true. Its disappearance left gaps, not just in formality, but in shared understanding. Without a single agreed-upon set of rules, interactions could feel uncertain. The Victorians may have been hypocritical and overbearing, but they were rarely confused about how to act in public. Now, without that safety net, people had to invent their own manners on the fly, and not everyone was equally skilled at it. The result was a more spontaneous society, but also a more unpredictable one. By the time Lionel walked away from Mrs. Grey's garden that afternoon, he realized something uncomfortable. The ghosts of Victorian etiquette were not just haunting the drawing rooms of the rich, they were haunting him too. He still straightened his back in company, still felt uneasy eating before everyone else was served, still heard the echo of old rules in his mind. And perhaps he always would. The era might be gone, but the training, the conditioning, was forever. And so, the Victorian age didn't end with a clean break. It dissolved slowly, leaving behind traces that seeped into the bones of the generations that followed. Even today, when we roll our eyes at the stiffness of the past, we carry fragments of it in our greetings, our small talk, and our unspoken expectations of others. We might think we've outgrown those ghosts, but every time we pause before interrupting, every time we write, "Yours sincerely," at the end of a letter, every time we nod politely to a stranger, we prove they're still here. They've just learned how to live among us without being seen. And so, the grand theatre of Victorian etiquette finally draws its curtains. We've walked through drawing rooms thick with expectation, dined under chandeliers that dripped with both wax and judgment, and navigated the strange labyrinth where politeness and hypocrisy held hands. The era is gone, but the ghosts remain. Some welcome, some best left in the past. And maybe that's the real lesson. History never fully leaves us. It just changes its clothes. If you've enjoyed drifting through this world with me, I'd be delighted to have you back for more. You're listening to The Drowsy Historian, where history slows down enough for you to taste it, laugh at it, and maybe even fall asleep with it, still whispering in your ear. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next midnight wander through the strange and forgotten corners of the past.